Hi, everybody. It's Emil. It's Emil Guillermo. Emil amongst you. Welcome to another edition of Emil amongst Takeout. This is the longer, infrequent, audio-only version available on your favorite podcast app, but available most times at www.amok.com, Monday through Friday daily. That explains our infrequency. Just go to www.amok.com. Catch us live on Facebook Watch, Monday through Friday, 2 p.m. Pacific. We generally talk about the news from an Asian American Filipino perspective. My takes on all things considerables served up to you. So on amok.com, you can check out my takes on ESPN, Disney's Stephen A. Smith, who on First Take made racist remarks about baseball's best player, Shohei Ohtani. Go to show 91. You hear my take on Stephen A. And hear my take on Richard Branson's not quite trip to the edge of space and why it doesn't compare to what an Asian immigrant like my dad experienced. All that on amok.com. But this podcast is special. One of my projects is to chronicle Little Manila Rising, a grassroots project in Stockton, California, and what it's doing to elevate the Asian American community there. And today I talked to one of its youth advocate leaders. Now, we pay a lot of lip service to the young, but who are they and what are they thinking? What are they saying? Why should we pay attention? Well, we should if they're our future and we want to be part of it. So today I talked to Celine Lopez, born and raised in Stockton, and instead of leaving the Bay Area or Los Angeles, she returned to her home city. That's significant because she graduated with honors from Stanford University as a first-generation student and earned a BA in Comparative Studies in Race and Ethnicity, a BA in Urban Studies, and a Spanish minor. Celine is passionate about co-creating knowledge about her hometown through urban sociological research and oral storytelling shared by community members. Her honors thesis about her hometown Stockton was inspired by the life and work of the late Dr. Don Bohalana Mabalan, and the thesis was titled All Roads Lead to Stockton, where Celine explored the history of Stockton and analyze the role of boomerangs, what they call young college-educated people who return to give back to their community. And that's where I saw Celine in action. She was in Stockton and leading young Stocktonians at a Little Manila youth conference that was held recently. And it was really amazing to see young people care about where they're from and looking to each other on how to make a difference in Stockton. It was then that I realized that we need to hear from these young people, and we will talk to them, not necessarily this program today, but in subsequent programs. But first, here's Celine. We talk about her background, daughter of Mexican immigrants, and I say that because part of Little Manila Rising's greatness is that it's not just Filipino-American, but coalesces an entire community. The conference featured Filipinos as well as Latinx and African Americans. In our talk, we talk about how people perceive Stockton and how Celine wants to change that. We talk about the brain drain and how the boomerangs are trying to do a brain regeneration to make Stockton vital again, and how it hasn't been easy as a child of immigrants. At Stanford, she fought off the dreaded imposter syndrome and used her pride in her hometown to educate others about where she came from. And then it was the work of the late Dr. Don Mabalan, the Stanford-trained historian, who made Celine realize that Stockton was in the heart and would be the place she'd attempt to make her mark at Little Manila Rising. It's the nonprofit co-founded by Mabalan with Dylan Delvo. So here's my conversation with Celine Lopez, a youth advocate at Little Manila Rising, on how she and other young people are choosing to reclaim their history, their city, and their identity on a meal amongst takeout. Celine, thank you very much for joining us here. This is going to be
Thank
part.
you.
Yeah, this is going to be part of the Emil Amux takeout. But I'm doing a lot of things on Little Manila as an example of what the Filipino American community is doing, and of course, you'd like to say, hey, this is something that's happening nationwide, but the real effective things are happening at the grassroots level, and Little
Mhm.
Manila is the grassroots, right?
Right.
I mean, it's where the Filipinos are, it's where the people are, and
Mhm.
when you talk about the Central Valley in California, you can't get much more
Mhm.
grassroots than the Central Valley, huh?
No. I think for many, the Central Valley is that like nexus. It is that like focal point for a lot of not just migration and movement of people, but movements.
Yeah.
The farm worker movement, being the biggest one that we can think of. But even today, we see a lot of youth um, being empowered and leading in our communities. And I think that is probably the contemporary movement taking place in the Central Valley.
Yeah, and when you talk about the Central Valley, it's a huge area. You're talking about,
Mm-hmm.
well, not quite, well, yeah, you got to go all the way down to the Imperial Valley to get to the
Right.
southern point, right? And that's way
Mm-hmm.
down south. And then up north, do we include Sacramento? We have to include Sacramento in the Central Valley, right?
Yeah. I think, I think just not just geographically, but also the Central Valley being this place that's kind of like a global like epicenter of people, I I think being kind of like the roots of California, right?
Right.
We tend to dismiss how large the Central Valley is because we know that, larger cities like Los Angeles and San Jose and San Francisco are, in these coastal points, but the Central Valley is that biggest part of California. And um, maybe our towns are a little bit smaller, but I think these like impacts that we have are not just nationwide, but even a global,
Well,
connection.
when you talk about the ag, certainly, right? So
Hmm.
I guess I was sort of in jest when I said, well, do we include Sacramento? It's in the center part, but it extends far north of Sacramento. So
Hmm.
from maybe as far north, would you say Redding and Chico wouldn't, but maybe Redding might be, I mean, that's on the verge of the far north, but it goes all the way down
Right.
to the Imperial Valley. And but
Uh-huh.
the the real, where I say the heart of the Central Valley really does become, and it connects with history, right? With the gold rush, it becomes
Hmm.
Stockton, right?
Hmm.
Stockton, maybe to a little degree, Modesto and Fresno down south, but
Yeah.
and maybe Bakersfield is sort of, kind of, yeah, that's also far south
Hmm.
and further north than the Imperial Valley. So if I was going to include parts, you know, just north of the Imperial Valley, I can't joke about Bakersfield. It's there, but the beating heart, Stockton.
Hmm. I agree. And I'm biased from being from Stockton, and a lot of places in the Central Valley, I think, also have those roots like Delano and Fresno especially. But when you think about, the history and the settlements of the gold rush, like you said, Stockton, was that place that was starting to form this area when people started to head up to San Francisco in the gold rush era. Stockton was becoming one of the most rapidly growing areas, um, and became that like that central point where people were not just settling, but were creating business and economy and just like a livelihood somewhere. And I think we also have to think back to this land being also native land, and people being there, the Yokuts people and the Miwok people, right? And so there is that history of colonization also taking place at that point. Um, and so I think, today a lot of us are also, reckoning with those facts, right? A lot of that is true and exists at the same time. Stockton becoming this great place, um, but also that complex history. And today, when we think about people of color in our communities, a lot of migration and immigration taking place in the Central Valley, but also a lot of labor exploitation, with our farm worker communities. And so there's a lot of complex histories that have been taking place here. And what is interesting today is that we've been hearing and learning more about it. And I think that's really important for many of us, because when we go back to Little Manila and Little Manila Rising, right, that was the main driving force of the movement of Filipinos in Stockton, with Don and Dylan, you know, understanding where they're coming from, and the places that were home to them, but also places that were taken. Um, and so there's many layers to these histories, and I think there's always going to be these maybe processes of um, formation of communities, and also maybe some of the upheaval of them, and maybe some of the relearning about these histories and communities. And I know today for me and for many of my peers, that's been like the biggest uh, the biggest thing for us, is learning about the histories of this place of Stockton, and the histories of our families.
Yeah.
And so I think that um, it is a really like fascinating and fulfilling thing for many of us.
Yeah, because a lot of it has been forgotten or never
Hmm.
was, you know, never became part of the initial conversation when it came to education. You just
Hmm.
maybe have lived there, but you don't need to know much more about that. Just keep going
Right.
forward and maybe get out of here. But uh,
Hmm.
now there is an appreciation. And, I worked in Stockton for a couple of years, and that's where I met Dylan Delvo and Don Mabalan back around 2003. But even before then, my father came to America from the Philippines in the 20s and stopped in San Francisco, but we would come to Stockton. It was
Hmm.
always a long drive because it was the old Altamont, from San. So that was, but now I kept thinking this when I was working there, um, for when I worked at the Record. I kept thinking, wow, what happened to Stockton? I mean, I got a chance to really cover it as a reporter, as a journalist.
Hmm.
What do you think happened? It's almost like Stockton had its time in the 1840s. It had its time when the Yokut Miwoks were there. It had its time maybe around World War II, and it just seems like it stopped having its time. What do you think happened to Stockton? Just from your perspective now, as a young person who's now in Stockton,
Hmm.
what do you think happened to Stockton? Why did time stop? It would seem.
Hmm. Yeah, I think that is the question for many. Uh, it's interesting because um, earlier this year with Little Manila, we had a local historian, Philip Merlot, uh, give a presentation on Stockton's history, and he did that with all of the youth, involved in Little Manila Rising. And for a lot of us, learning about some of these things that were taking place in Stockton back in the day, like way before we, were ever conceived of, right? Um, it was kind of like a big surprise to hear about some of these things, like at one point Stockton had like the best education system in the nation, right? It was like ranked number one. And I think today, we laugh at that because, we come from Stockton and we went to those schools, and we know firsthand that uh, there's a lot of disinvestment in our local schools, and that's been happening, right? And so there's many instances of that. Stockton having this flourishing economy, in the gold rush era and even sometime after that. And we see today that, many of our communities are struggling, just with basic needs. And so um, that question of what happened really is something that we need to grapple with. And I think a lot of that takes place in policy. um, we saw a lot of urban renewal going on, not just in Stockton, but that was a trend nationwide. With the creation of suburbs and that movement, for suburbs, right? And I think a lot of people saw Stockton as a cool place, but also had issues with parts of our communities. And I know from just stories I've heard from family and people that, there was a place in Stockton called Skid Row. And that is actually where Little Manila used to be, just like decades earlier. But, through all these processes of policies, economic, and housing policies that push people out of, Little Manila and, forcibly displace them, but also allow these neighborhoods to, become blighted, right? To become forgotten and even unseen sometimes, right? We don't look at these places and take care of them. When Skid Row became this problem to the city at a point, um, their solutions, okay, we're going to have a freeway here, we're going to put a McDonald's there, we're going to have a gas station, and I think that is really the one of the shifting, I think, points for a lot of community members. And I think, going back to the origins of Little Manila Rising, what is progress, to who, and so is progress moving people away from their communities and then putting, a freeway that causes pollution in our communities, like these fast food places that don't serve our community. Um, so I think a lot of that has to do with policy and with, who are we investing in, for sure. I think another big trend that I was starting to examine in my own research was, how the media and how people looked at Stockton. And so, again, we saw Stockton as this, great place at one point, but I don't know when it happened. I don't think I was alive then, so I don't sure how far to trace it back, but definitely Stockton becoming, one of these places with a lot of people of color. Um, we started getting a lot of bad rep,
Yeah.
and a lot of just, yeah,
Well, it's
maybe a negative look
yeah,
on
yeah.
Stockton.
It sounds like at some point people forgot there was a community here. So when they moved people out and they put the freeway and they put a gas station and a McDonald's fast food, it was all to get people out, right? And they forgot to modernize the outpouring or the go through of people, but they forgot about the people who stayed here. They forgot about the community.
Mm.
And then when you
Mm-hmm.
match it, as you say, with the media and how the media looked on Stockton
Mm-hmm.
as, oh, that's the place over there for those people, right? We got othered. The city got othered in a way, right?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah,
Exactly.
and then how about this? I call the Central Valley, especially from say Turlock to Sacramento, as a news desert because
Mm-hmm.
everyone covers it from Sacramento. But if something's happening in
Mm-hmm.
Turlock or Modesto or Stockton, you're rarely going to go down to Stockton to cover it if you're based in Sacramento, right? And so when the TV stations say, we're Sacramento, Stockton, Modesto, well, how many times do they
Mm-hmm.
step foot in Modesto or Stockton? They cover all Sacramento up and up north toward Placerville. in Chico, right? And
Mhm.
suddenly, what happens to the news and what happens to the people in Stockton?
Here.
Yeah,
Yeah.
they get ignored, and you see how the
Mhm.
paper has fared, how it's kind of been decimated. Local ownership
Mhm.
sold to corporations, to hedge funds that have gutted it.
Mhm.
It's a news desert. No one is giving us information about ourselves. So when we look at the mirror of
Mhm.
the
Mhm.
media that covers us thinks we're like, well, nothing's there, you know. And then we and people who live here and look to the media, we don't see ourselves. We're not reflected.
Right. I
So
agree.
yeah, so it sort of gives you maybe a low self image of stock or no image of Stockton.
Yeah, and I think the low self-image, that you mentioned, I think that's exactly on point as well because, what I started to look at is how the media affects, just people's perspectives of themselves, especially young people. And so, in my honors thesis, that was kind of the like one of the driving forces of it because I grew up in a time when Stockton, we still had a local newspaper that was, really popular at the time and was doing a lot of work to cover the media in Stockton. But I think both local and national forces, you know, perpetuated these ideas of Stockton, right?
Yeah.
And when I was growing up, um, something very interesting started to happen where Forbes magazine would put out these lists of cities and would rank them, and I believe in when was it like 2009, 2011, Forbes magazine named Stockton the most miserable city in the United States. And
Yeah.
so that became a trend for a couple of years where every year we ranked number one, on Forbes magazine's list of the most miserable cities.
Wait,
But we were also on
wait,
other kinds of lists,
wait a minute. How did that make you feel when you were on the most miserable city list? How old were you, first of all?
I was probably, I don't know, maybe between the ages of like 10 and 13, 14, maybe.
Yeah.
So, at that point, I was not I was not immersed in really the media or really in politics, like, what child is, right? And
Yeah.
so I didn't really have an understanding of what those things meant. But it wasn't just Forbes magazine. I think many forces were also perpetuating those ideas, I think a big thing were teachers in our community. A lot of teachers in Stockton aren't from Stockton or they don't live in Stockton. And even sometimes, family and your parents, right? Um, I think, you know, a lot of people had to say, Stockton isn't a great place.
Yeah.
A lot of things like that, right? And so I would be told a lot by teachers, by family, Stockton, is a place that you should leave. When you grow up, you should be going to school, you should get an education, go to college, leave, and then, go find success somewhere. And that was kind of the image I had, you know, for pretty much my entire childhood.
Wow.
And I so I did. I was like, okay, I'm gonna do really well in school. I'm gonna go to college, and that's it, And I didn't know what was out there and what was going to be next for me, but I just knew that it wasn't going to be here. At
So
least that's what I was taught,
so let's
And I think that's true for a lot of young people.
let's go to where we should have at the beginning in terms of your story, because your story really shows how someone has to deal with all that we just talked about and overcomes that to say, this is my home. This is where I'm from, and it's where I'm going to create my life.
Hmm.
And so, tell me about your parents. Your parents are Filipino and
So I'm actually Mexican. Both of my parents are from Mexico.
okay,
Yeah, so both of them were born in Mexico and immigrated to the United States, at different points. of their lives. My mom, she grew up in a small town in Durango, and with her mother, they came to Pasadena, California, and lived in Pasadena throughout the 70s. Around that time, my dad had already come to Stockton. He immigrated here with his parents, and it's interesting because although my mom was in Pasadena for a while, her dad was actually here up in the Stockton, Sacramento area for farm work. And she had a lot of family out here in Stockton already. And my dad had a lot of family, you know, from the program here too. And so I think when we think about the quote from Dawn, "All roads lead to Stockton," I find that a very personal story. So my parents end up meeting in Los Angeles. They come back here to Stockton, and this became their home ever since the 70s, really. Um, and so they've seen a lot of changes in Stockton, and I hear from their stories a lot. Every time we're driving down, downtown, it's like, oh, this used to be like where our restaurant was. This used to be where we used to live. Your uncle used to live right here. This used to be one of the best restaurants in the city. So I hear a lot of those stories, which is really fun to get to know about, since I grew up in such a different Stockton than they know.
Yeah.
And I think that's a lesson that I love to learn, learning from our elders and from our families, our histories and how these places have changed.
Yeah. Well, tell me. All right. So you're Mexican American, born here,
I was born here
and
in Stockton.
you're working at Little Manila.
Hmm.
I made the wrong assumption because we're all colonized by the Spanish, and my last name is Guillermo. I say it the Filipino way, but which is the Ly, double L is Ly instead of YY. But look, there has always been a very strong connection between the Filipino American and the Mexican American community.
Yes.
So it doesn't surprise me that you should find a kind of spiritual home at Little Manila Rising.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it has to do, with solidarity, and also with a shared, like you mentioned, a shared struggle and a shared community that, our ancestors and our people lived in this, here in Stockton in the Central Valley, but also just, again, like, I like to connect things from local to global, because it is like a global shared story and experience of migrations, and a lot of times, sometimes forced migrations, and how labor became uh, that central part of our communities.
Yeah.
We relied on jobs, and jobs relied on us.
Yeah, or and ag specifically relied
Hmm.
on the people there in Stockton.
Hmm.
Well, one of the things that got me, I know I've talked to Dylan Delvo about the youth of Little Manila Rising and how they're
Hmm.
going to really you know, really bring the next generation forward and change Stockton.
Hmm.
And I was impressed when I saw you and others lead this a forum. I mean, I thought, well, I'll talk to some young people at some point about their vision for Stockton, but I was
Hmm.
surprised that you put on a forum for that it attracted about 50 to 100 people, and there we were online because it was still uh, the pandemic was still
Hmm.
keeping us limited. But I was fascinated, and I said I've got to talk to Celine, and also there was another, 'cause you're Mexican American. There was another woman there
Hmm.
who was African American. They're all part of the South Stockton, Little Manila area, and I thought this is real grassroots diversity. What is really? It's a grassroots diversity social justice movement breeding right there in Stockton. There's something
Mhm.
important going on there, in other words.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
and so I was so you were born in Stockton. You went to school in Stockton. You mentioned that, and
Mhm.
do you think that you got an education in spite of the poor, sort of, as you put it, the disinvestment in education in Stockton? Was it you driving things, or do you think I know, or do you think that yeah, there's education there for people who want it, but do you think there was
Mhm.
some motivation in you really that kind of forced the issue more?
I think there's many things, definitely first and foremost, I think my family really encouraged me and my siblings to do well in school and to go to college for sure. Neither of my parents had college degrees. So for them, it was important to see their children, succeed. And I think especially at the time that I was growing up, we started seeing these financial crises and understanding that, for a lot of us, we're going to need college degrees, right? But for me growing up, I think a lot of it was also kind of like navigating and struggling with, some of those internal like feelings of, okay, like, am I not good enough? Or, I'm from this place that people say is bad and people look down on, but what about me? Like, who am I? Right. And I think a lot of that was just, yeah, I did have a lot of motivation to do well in school. Um, but I think for a lot of students, that can't be it all the time. Like I was fortunate to have, encouraging parents and parents who were able to support me, one, but also I had teachers who supported me. And a lot of
Right.
students don't have that,
Yeah.
and I think that's true of our school system for sure. And I think just the national education system and how we track and place students, that's a whole other conversation.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
but
I
I
mean,
think for sure a lot of the motivation was kind of this like in spite of what others around me think of me, of my school, of my community. And I definitely saw that when I was in high school, I was invited to go to certain conferences. I was in a journalism program in high school, and that's where we saw kind of a lot of just gaps, I
yeah.
guess, between us and between other schools that we were competing against. And I
Yeah.
was starting to learn, okay, you know,
Yeah. Well, the
we're
thing.
coming from a totally different place.
I mean, the thing about your story, very similar to mine. I grew up in San Francisco, though, but there, you mentioned tracking.
Hmm.
Most kids from where I went to school were tracked into different type of paths, right?
Hmm.
So you're in the path that's going to take gym and wood shop versus you're in the path who might consider college, but you're not smart enough. Or you're definitely in the path that's going to go to college if you get the breaks, and so you get a different set of classes. And
Hmm.
you rarely, I mean, everyone was tracked on these parallel paths, and you only saw people at lunch where they took your money. If you're in the smart class, they took your money, or in gym where maybe if you're good in sports, you got to play with each other and got to know each other, so they'd give back the money that they took from you at lunch, and then you saw each other at the junior high dance or something, But it was a
Hmm.
strange world, and I was lucky that someone recognized that maybe I could go to college, right? You
Right.
you have to be picked almost. Someone's got to say, "You, there's a
Yeah.
light there. It's not like a
Hmm.
a blighted home in some, abandoned neighbor. There's a light there, and so
Hmm.
we're going to do something with you." I mean, it's almost did
Yes.
you get that feeling that some
Yes.
people discovered you and said, "Celine, you're going to go far."
I think, yeah, I think for sure that that is part of it. And I think like you said, you have to be chosen, you have to be hand selected, and that is a huge problem in our education system. It's a huge problem in just the these pipelines from the moment you're born to every single point in your lifetime. what are the steps, what are the people behind you that takes you there, right?
Yeah.
And I think that goes back to this idea of like not just investing in places, but we need to invest in people. And so that's why the work that we're doing at Little Manila, I think, is so just pivotal for a lot of people's lives, because you're seeing more and more youth, becoming involved and being connected with other people.
Yeah.
When I was growing up, I didn't have a lot of connections to community, a lot of connections to movements and nonprofits and groups, right? I had, I was able to find myself there because I have people supporting me and allowing me to grow into the person I am. But a lot of youth need, they need families, they need
Yeah.
communities, and I think that sometimes that's something that we miss from education, is looking into that larger picture of, how are we connecting young people to each other and to other people.
Yeah, and just think what happens when that connection isn't made and it's
Mhm.
missed and someone is just like
Mhm.
looking around saying, "Well, no one picked me. No, where do I go?" They're
Mhm.
lost or they have to fend for themselves and they don't often have the wherewithal to make the best possible choice. I mean, if you want to talk about the optimal choice, they can take, well, I guess this means I'm going to go here, you know, but they could go several steps higher than that if someone said that, yeah, you have that opportunity. But no one just,
Mhm.
and I just thought about that when I was looking at the young people at that conference,
Mhm.
because it's got to make a difference for people if someone says
Mhm.
to them, like an older person, and I say you're probably all of what 22 or 23, an older person tapping someone younger, a 15-year-old or a 10-year-old
Mhm.
or a 12-year-old or what,
Mhm.
and saying, "Hey, you can go places.
Mhm.
You have a future."
Mhm.
That's got to mean
Mhm.
something, right?
Mhm. And it may not just be like you can go places, right? But you're somebody. And I
Yeah.
think that's and I think that's something that is really important for young people to hear and to feel affirmed and validated, that, they're not just there, to do what people tell them to do, and, to live this life that they think they need to have, right? But it's like you're a person that, has value and has meaning, and the dreams and the visions that you have are real, and that's something that you can own and bring out into this world. And so, and that's at that conference, that's something that, I wanted to do with my workshop, and talking about like what are the visions and the dreams and the futures that young people aspire for, right? And it's not just like what should they aspire for, because I think education is such an important thing, and going to college definitely for me was really important. But and I think it is sometimes necessary today, but you know is that the dream that we should all have? I think we can and should dream beyond like getting a bachelor's degree, right? I think we want to dream for our communities and for our people, and um the well-being of each other, right? And sometimes it's going back to very basic ideas of like, sometimes we just want to dream to be happy. We want
Yeah.
to dream to live and thrive, right? And when we think about places like Stockton, I think young people for many generations were robbed of that. I think even people who lived in Stockton were robbed of that, just because we were told constantly by media, by other people, by our policymakers that, you know, these are places that aren't worth anything. These are places that aren't worth investment, that aren't worth, even people living there, right? Um, and so today, I think what's most important for us is to like, reclaim our history, reclaim our narratives, reclaim our places, but also reclaim just our ability to dream and aspire and and just have a vision for what is Stockton for us, and I think that is what's going to propel a lot of great change, for our community.
Right. And just going up to a young person who was at that conference and just to say, you count, you matter, your visions
Mm-hmm.
matter, and to
Mm-hmm.
talk to them in a way that communicates with them. To talk to them about the things that they care about in the way that they care about things. I mean, we know that they're all tech savvy, so all those little gizmos you had with the maps, an older guy like me, I was lost. Someone's got to help me get in the right page here. But
Right.
they, I know other people were like, oh yeah, here, doom, they just do all the tech stuff. But
Mhm.
so they've got the technology down, but now someone's got to say, hey, look, the dream you have is real, and you count. Your
Mhm.
voice counts. Your vision counts. I was so happy to
Mhm.
see that, and then also I was so happy to see that there was acknowledgement of other differences that previous generations would have an issue with about either their sexuality or how they view gender or how they view themselves. I mean, this was totally open, and people were, um,
Mhm.
I think, it was a very modern, youthful conference. And if only they were in charge, right?
Mhm. Yes, definitely. And I think that's what's the most liberating about being a young person is that although there are many things at play that kind of determine, what our life should look like and would look like, but I think young people still have a lot of desire to just be open and to be free for things. And so I think that's why it's so important to, you know, foster, those tendencies and that just natural inclination to daydream or to imagine, right? And
Dream,
that's kind of one
yeah.
of our
Yeah.
yeah, it's one of our most like basic skills that we have. And I think a lot of times we start to learn, we get taught like, okay, you can't do that, that's too idealistic. We need to be more reality, right? And I just think we should reject that as much as we can as human beings, because I think that's what limits us when we start to go into, okay, what should education look like? What should these policies look like? What should these communities look like? And I think that is really damaging, because then we start to see, okay, well, this community isn't doing well, let's put a freeway there,
Right.
or this student isn't doing well, let's put them, you know, in this class just so they'll get by,
Right, and
you know?
it could also be a generational thing. Like an older
Mhm.
person of color would say, "Well, this happened to me, so it's not going to happen to you. So let's just settle for this." And
Mhm.
and suddenly the dreams of the young person are just kind of
Mhm.
squashed, and what and then life goes on the same. And I don't want to put down members of the older generation, which I'm a part of also, because I think that we need to come together. We need to work
Yeah.
together. We're not, but it shouldn't be like younger people looking at their parents because everyone wants to kind of like separate and stay away from their parents. But there are people who are not your parents who are older who can be helpful and
Mhm.
who have your best interests at heart also in terms of
Yes.
where a community can go. And it's a kind of
Yes.
a broader coalition, a generational
Mhm.
coalition that has the community in mind. But
Mhm.
I just like the fact that there are all these young people there and they had a vision about exactly what should happen. And exactly, so, you know, getting back to the conference, you were from Stockton, went to school in Stockton. You got a chance to go to Stanford, which
Mhm.
is I think that's great. I mean, there's you shouldn't be modest about that. You had an opportunity, and what was that experience like for you? And what did that teach you? What did that teach you about yourself and about
Mhm.
Stockton?
Yeah, I think that's where a lot of it happened. I think it was interesting because when I left Stockton to go to Stanford, it was at, this very like just changing time, for our community, right? I graduated Stockton from I graduated I graduated from high school in Stockton in 2016. And so that was right in the middle of the presidential election. But not only was that happening, in this kind of nationwide movement of like young people kind of getting into this political consciousness, right? At that time, we're also having a local election here in Stockton for our mayor. And for the first time, a lot of us, young people, and even just people here in Stockton, older people too, we're seeing a very young person, run for mayor. Um, and when I went to Stanford, I was just like super invested in what was happening, at home. We saw Michael Tubbs run for mayor, and it was a very, I think, very like just contested, kind of race. There was a lot going on, a lot of like just in the media, like what was happening there with like and even just people, like what people were deciding, like what is Stockton going to look like moving forward, and how, like, who's going to be best for that, right? And I think young people are also part of that conversation for sure, because Michael, what he did really well was bring young people into the conversation and show them like a champion for young people, right? And so for me, I was witnessing all of that happening, and I was part of it. I was like, invested in this change and wanting to see, a movement for Stockton that would be better, right? At the same time, I was going to Stanford, one of the, they it is like one of the best institutions in the world, also one of the most, wealthy institutions in the world. And very I was just very naive at the time. I knew that Stanford was a place that was going to set me up for success, and that's, how I ended up there. I wanted that, right? But I also came in with a lot of feelings of leaving Stockton behind, right? That because that's what I was always told, and that's what I always imagined. And I found myself in this place that could not look any more different than like where I came from, and that to me was a really big just like culture shock. And I think when you were mentioning like all the diversity that you saw at our conference with Little Manila, that for us that's easy. Like it would be hard to not have any diversity, because I grew up with in schools, with all kinds of different people, and who had families that came from all different parts of the world, right? And to me, I never really like questioned that. I thought that was normal. And I go to Stanford and I go to my freshman dorm, and there's like maybe a couple other people who are like Latinas or Latinx people, a couple other Black people in the dorm. And that was kind of like, we were it. And it was really hard for me to find a community at Stanford my first year, because I didn't know anyone that went to Stanford before me, and I had no connection to that place. I had no connection to the area. And I found myself just really missing where I was from. I missed, the people I went to school with. I missed the community. I missed going and getting a taco at a taco truck. They didn't have things like that. And so it was just a lot of like me coming to terms and realizing like what I had in Stockton and how unique that could be. I would talk to people about their hometowns or where they're from. And a lot of times they did have, kind of negative associations with Stockton. And I had to constantly fight that and be like, no, like that's not what it's about. Like, and I would talk about my city with a lot of pride. I would talk about, Michael Tubbs just became our mayor. Like, I would be shouting out Stockton everywhere I went.
Right.
And I constantly felt like I was having to explain myself or explain where I was from or explain my people and my city. And it just became this kind of like, I don't know, this fire maybe inside of me of just wanting to continue to prove myself. And I think that's an interesting thing that a lot of us, at least in my generation, have been finding, is that we're constantly trying to prove ourselves, not just when we're in Stockton, and proving ourselves to our teachers or to maybe our family, to our peers, right? But also for those of us who left Stockton and went to college, it's now we're like proving ourselves again, to another group of people who probably, how do look down on our community, right? And so that's what I was doing for pretty much my whole career, and I think it was rewarding to start see people change their minds about Stockton. I have so many friends who, come visit me here now, or who, they tell me stories of how they met someone else from Stockton, and they like just lit up and was like, oh my God, really? I can't believe you're from Stockton. Like one of my really close friends is from there. Or they're like in a class and it mentions Stockton for some reason, and they find themselves knowing a lot of facts
Yeah.
about Stockton. And so I find that to be really funny. But one of the biggest things that I was able to do, I pursued this honors thesis. And I think I started to find myself as like a researcher, as like a scholar, as a person who questions a lot of things. And I think that experience of leaving Stockton and going to a place like Stanford really, you know, really spur that like kind of formation in me of like, okay, what are these things that I've been examining my whole life? Like, what are these things that I've been navigating? And why is this not being talked about? Or like, why are other people not talking about this in the same way? Right. And so I felt like, in my conversations with classmates and in my urban studies classes, and we would talk about, how cities are formed and how people are formed in these cities, right? I felt like Stockton was always missing from these conversations. And so I just wanted to bring it to the table, you know?
So you were your major was in
It was in urban studies,
urban
and I
studies,
did a double major in comparative studies and race and ethnicity. So
and so
ethnic
this
studies, pretty much.
is your honors thesis. And when you did it, did
Hmm.
you find yourself getting mad at Stanford or at Stanford types? Did you find yourself making peace with Stanford and Stanford types? And
uh,
how did you
yeah.
deal with that the parallel universe that they seem to be
Hmm.
in, that you have now been able to enter
Hmm.
and do
Hmm.
this honors work?
Yeah.
How do you reconcile the differences?
Yeah. I think that's something a lot of my friends, other first generation students who also came from low income backgrounds. I have so many friends who I found at Stanford that I learned had similar experiences as me. They came from places that were like looked down on. Whether they came from like East Oakland, Waukegan, Illinois, wherever they came from, whatever community they came from, it was another like a part of their identity was like this constant struggle. And so when a lot of us come to Stanford, that's that doesn't change just because we, are Stanford students. We still carry all of that with us. We carry these legacies that have gone on for centuries, basically. But a lot of it also, what is interesting is that, sometimes you get used to it. And I talk with my friends, after we graduated about it, like some things at Stanford are so, you know, they're just not real experiences for many people. And it's like, wow, I can't believe we were at this like $1 billion institution that like gave us money to do anything, to travel, to study abroad, to like have go to wine tasting experiences, like just things that I would not associate with like going to college, right? And for many college students, that is not what their college experience is like at all. And so it is a lot of the reconciling with there's a lot of money here, there's a lot of privilege here, and Stanford does give you access to that. At the same time, doing this thesis, it was a challenge because not only am I facing, what I felt was again these like negative stereotypes that I see from, maybe not just like peers, but also again those institutions like the media. It's also facing like academia, and in academia there is nothing there on Stockton. And what I ended up finding out was Dawn.
Yeah, Don's
And
book.
Dawn
Yeah.
was Yeah, and she really became that beacon for me of like, wow, I can't believe here is this first generation woman of color, this Pinay Filipina woman from Stockton, from South Stockton, who, made her way to Stanford, became the first Pinay to get a PhD in history at Stanford, and wrote her dissertation on Stockton, and then wrote a book on Stockton that became, one of these most foundational pieces of like Filipino history in the United States. And to me, that was so like pivotal. I was like, oh my gosh, because I kept finding myself as like, I'm this person, who went to Stanford despite all these odds. And I'm like one of the only people from Stockton to ever step foot in this institution. And it was a very lonely feeling because, I knew other people who, they had parents that went to Stanford, or they had, classmates, a couple years before them who made it to Stanford. And that wasn't true for me. So um, to learn about Dawn and her life and the work she did was just very important to me, and showed me that like someone did it already,
Yeah,
and it took a lot of pressure off of me.
it did you
you know
did you engage with Little Manila before you got to Stockton or before you got to Stanford, or did you know of Don before you got to Stanford?
No, and I wish I did. And so I didn't grow up in South Stockton, and I didn't I wasn't connected with Little Manila. So I found my way there, and a lot of it was interesting because a lot of us, I think even Dylan would say this, like going to college is sometimes the first time that we learn about Stockton. And so I was at Stanford, in urban studies classes, and we would get, assignments to research a city and research this and that. And I was like, okay, I'm gonna research Stockton. Let's see what I can find. And a lot, again, in academia, there isn't a whole lot on Stockton. And so what I found myself relying on was the record newspaper, or was even blogs online. And so I ended up finding, Little Manila Rising. And I was just like, oh my gosh, the largest community of Filipinos outside of the Philippines was in Stockton, yeah, at some point. Learning about our Chinatown, it was like the third largest Chinatown in the United States. Learning about all of these histories that I didn't know. I grew up knowing about Dolores Huerta, Cesar Chavez. I learned about Larry Long later in my life, but what I knew about Stockton's history was the farm workers movement. What was missing of that was the Filipinos in that movement. Um,
So it
and what was missing of everything was just all of these communities. And so I got to learn about them, you know, through this research.
Yeah, so it's funny that you went to Stanford to find Dawn and Stockton, and now you're at Little Manila. Tell me, how did your well before we leave Stanford, there's this
Yes.
idea known as the imposter syndrome that people talk
Mhm.
about. Uh, do
Mhm.
uh, you shake your head or you nod your head like
I know.
you know what it's about? How do you
Yes.
think that applies to your life, if it applies at all? Has it come up?
That's interesting.
Has it come up
Yeah,
to
I
as
don't
we
I don't
think about it?
know. I feel like I've always been the type of person that was very confident in myself, and sometimes maybe a little cocky. Like I knew I was smart, and I knew I had something in me. And I think a part of that was just, people around me affirmed that a lot. But going to Stanford changes that a little bit for many, and I think for me too, because I started seeing, okay, I don't think I was set up for this correctly. I don't think I had the best education sometimes. I felt that a lot. I was really good at math when I was, a student in Stockton, and then I go to Stanford, and I'm taking like the basic math classes. I thought I was taking advanced math in high school, and I find out, I'm far behind for a place like Stanford. And so a lot of it, I felt the shortcomings of my experience and my education. And I felt, very discouraged a lot of times to do certain things because, I wasn't really well read. I thought I was. And then I come to find out, oh no, I needed to read, Socrates and Virgil and all of these people, years ago. So I was not prepared for many things. Um, but I don't think that should stop anyone, because obviously, a lot of us, we make it, and we come to find out some of those tests of knowledge aren't really that important.
Yeah. Well,
For what I was doing, it was it was being a thinker. It was being someone who envisioned and who had ideas, and who could articulate them, and I think that's something that a lot of us as first generation students, we have to find out, because it's definitely like when you first come in, you feel that imposter syndrome, like, wow, like I'm not cut out for this, like I'm not as smart as these people. For a lot of it, it's like, hmm, you have a lot that they don't,
yeah. Well,
and you have a lot of experiences that that make you like someone that can excel,
or
you know.
it makes you unique. Now, one thing, did you ever feel shame about where you were from,
Mm,
or for the shame for what you did not have that you thought you should have?
I think initially I felt like, okay, like I felt very different because I knew I came from, like a more low income background than pretty much like 90% of my peers that were there. And so a lot of times I would talk to people and just find out like they came from a totally different world than me. And so sometimes I was like, I don't really know how to, relate to this person. I don't know how to, form ties with this person. I don't know how they'll look at me, if they knew more about my life. Like if I brought them here to Stockton, would they make fun of me? You know what I mean? And so a lot of that, I think I did feel like very, very much othered in that experience. But I think the shame, although may some of it may have been there, I think a lot of it just became like this desire to again to like prove them wrong, or to show them what I was about, or show them what Stockton was about. Because I'm a person that's like, no, like I don't, like if they have a opinion or a view on Stockton that I felt was incorrect, I'm like, no, like I have to correct that right now. And
See,
so I think a lot of it was doing
yeah,
that.
and that indicates a healthy self worth. You may have indicated some shame, but the energy from that shame can be used in a positive way. If it's used negatively, you just spiral down into, yeah, I'm not good enough, I'm not worthy, But if you use it positively, you
Hmm.
you understand that you are worthy of success, you're worthy of love, and
Hmm.
you can't be worthy and be ashamed, or you can't be ashamed, or you be, you know, uh, you can't be hurt by shame if you have this sense of your worthiness for success or worthiness of love. And clearly,
Hmm.
you had enough of that to get you out of the kind of spiral that people who have, imposter
Hmm.
syndrome has been identified and talked about for the last 25 years or so, and they usually identify
Hmm.
it with women who are in positions, because it was
Yes.
the male female thing. But now, more recently, people see it in terms of the race, the
Hmm.
race the race thing. But you have shown how you get out of that by feeling a sense of pride and worthiness. And it must have come out really strong when you wrote that honors thesis.
Yeah, I think for sure, like what was really fulfilling about, completing the honors thesis, I graduated unfortunately when the pandemic, started. And so my last quarter was online. But I think what was really good about that was that I was able to invite like my whole community to my honors thesis presentation. And so what was really cool about it is that, seeing all of these people log on to the Stanford Zoom meeting, and it was like just hella Stockton people, like my friends, people I went to high school with, people I worked with, leaders that I was connected to that like were really, supportive of me and of the idea of my thesis, young people and even some people that I interviewed in my thesis. And so having them come and see it and just hyping it up in our little Zoom chat and really just loving to see like Stockton portrayed in that way. For a lot of people, like it was the first time to see Stockton research or Stockton written about. And for me, I mean, it also was one of the first experiences of that. So I thought that was just amazing, and it made me feel a lot of pride in that moment to share that
Yeah.
with everyone.
Well, it's important that a place like Stanford, you're allowed to do a thing on Stockton because there's a kind of um, poetic justice that you're allowed to present your Stockton vision. So
Mm-hmm.
tell me what that Stockton vision, all roads lead to Stockton. What did you find and where could it
Mm-hmm.
be policy that could
Mm-hmm.
change how Stockton is seen?
Yeah. So with my thesis, I had the opportunity to interview 12 young people who grew up in Stockton and found their way to college. And we're now in this place in their lives where they're reckoning with a lot of the things we've been talking about. Is Stockton the place I go back to? Is there a future for me in Stockton? Or, should I pursue what I have been taught, like to leave? And so in interviewing these people, we really got to just sit down and think about, what has our experience been like? What are our histories with Stockton, and what are the things that we grew up to believe? And now what are the things that, maybe we're shedding away, that we're just discarding and dismissing and reclaiming about Stockton. And that's what I found that was really cool. um that these young people found themselves having a lot of pride in Stockton, and maybe for similar reasons that I did, going to college. But they carried that with them and they made it known. And so it kind of became this story of like, reclaiming a narrative, reclaiming a place, and maybe even reclaiming your own identity as like, I'm from Stockton, right? And so that was something that was really central from my findings. Another thing that was a little bit more interesting was a lot of these young people still are unsure about where their future is and if it's in Stockton. And so for a lot of them, they saw Stockton as like this place where they're from, this, the place where their roots will always be, and a place that they're always going to love and be connected to, but felt a little unsure of like, are they going to make it in Stockton? A lot of them were interested in music and arts, and they just felt that there was nothing there in Stockton. Although there's like they said there's a growing, underground maybe like art scene. It's still not respected as much as going to LA or maybe New York, right, where we see the arts. And so I think what was interesting in those examples was that a lot of these young people pointed out that, there just aren't a lot of opportunities for us here. And the opportunities that are there, like maybe they outgrew them, or maybe, they needed a different pace, or they needed something that was going to invest in them a little bit more. And so I think that helps us call for, increased investment in Stockton, and looking at Stockton not as a place that, uh, people are doing bad in, or people are doing poorly in. Because I think a lot of the policy we have today is trying to remedy like people, right? Because we see people as a problem in Stockton. We see homeless people as a problem, and we see, people in poverty as a problem. I think the problem that we need to tackle is how do we, meet people's basic needs, and then how do we go beyond that? How do we let people thrive? How do we let them, get an education and then excel in something that they're passionate about, like music, or whatever it may be. And that's the thing that a lot of these young people, struggled with for sure. And so when we think about policy, I think a lot of it has to do with like investing in a future for Stockton, because I don't think that's what a lot of our leaders look at. I think we're looking at, again, these issues that we minimize into small problems that we can fix. Oh, okay, so we have a large homelessness population and it's creating blight and an eyesore. So then let's just move these people out of the way and let's like renew the area. That's not solving anything, right? And we know that from histories of urban policy. So what we need to look at is starting to look at Stockton as a place that has a future, because I don't think anyone has ever imagined Stockton as a place that has a future, and not a bright one for sure. And that's something that I really wanted to bring out in my thesis, with these people who felt that they could be a part of it. A lot of them felt this strong desire to come back and to change it, and
Yeah.
to be the person, I want to be the person that creates a music school in Stockton, or I want to be a person that, is a counselor and tells students where I was 10 years ago that they matter and that they can, achieve. I want to be the person that, starts whatever it may be, but a lot of them felt like they needed to come back because they needed to be there and invest in that future. And I think, um, we're seeing more of that from young people today, and that's where I hope we steer policy, is towards those investments of like lifetime, these lifetime, visions for what our people can and will be.
All right. So talk about how you would prioritize things. What would the top three areas be? And I'd imagine this is something you would do. Now, your current position at Little Manila, you work as a, what is your title there now?
I'm a project coordinator for the COVID-19 outreach and education program. Our program is called Trust. So that's what I'm doing. We're helping people with their basic needs right now, during the pandemic, and specifically trying to prevent COVID-19 from, spreading further in our community.
Okay, so that's what you're doing now with Little Manila. But tell me,
Mm-hmm.
if you were to take aspects of your thesis, your honors thesis,
Mm-hmm.
and through Little Manila, trying to
Right.
see how what three areas would you prioritize, and then how would you match it with aspects of your thesis as a solution to those three areas that you're prioritizing?
Broadly, what I see as the you know the biggest things that we need to work on and invest in, one, housing being like the most basic necessity that people have the right to have. And I think in Stockton, there's a really long history with housing being an issue. And so I think the best way to remedy that is to provide housing and to house people, and to just create protections for people living in, rental units and things like that. I think if we don't do that soon, we're going to see a much larger crisis. We already see that happening in the Bay Area, and I know for a fact that uh, it, that is going to really impact Stockton. So housing has to be our priority number one, um, because if people aren't living in a safe place, then all the other things you're doing, if you're investing in all these other areas, it's not gonna work. I think education definitely always needs to be a priority. And I think the way that we look at education maybe needs to be re-examined, and how we teach young people and what we're teaching. And so what is really beautiful right now, and something as part of Little Manila's legacy, is the introduction of ethnic studies in Stockton schools. And so all of the ethnic studies teachers at Stockton, SUSD, like shout out to them, because they're really building that program from the ground up. And I was able to be a part of, creating some of that curriculum. And I think, I think if we let ethnic studies flourish and lead, I think we'll begin to see, a different education system. And so we need to think about, how we're investing in people, right? And that's one of the first ways to do it. I think lastly is just economic opportunity and economic vitality, right? Because we see so many of our community members struggle uh, with all of their basic needs because they lack the resources to do so. Um, and so, before we can imagine like, okay, how do I as a, college education college educated person come back and, find a job here? Before we think about that, we have to think about our community members who, are working several jobs and can barely make it by, right? Or, can't work because of disability or something, right? And how are we uplifting them and providing for them, right? So I think when we invest in those three basic things, we start connecting the dots for sure. I think, we settle the basic needs for housing, education, and economic needs, and we start seeing, maybe some growth in in what we want to see in Stockton. I think a lot of leaders have discussed like the brain drain that happens in Stockton because so many college educated people from here leave, right? And they want them to come back. So there's a lot of investment in these people, right? Because they're so desirable. And I think that's very dismissive of everyone else who has been here, right? So that's what I see, and I think that's what from my conversations with my participants is also something they recognize too. A lot of it is like, before they can think about the dreams they have for themselves, they have to think about their families who are still here.
Yeah.
They have to think about the people that they had to leave when they went to college, and that's unfortunately that's something that we're still having to fix.
And how can Little Manila be a part of that
Hmm.
change? Um, by advocating for youth who go out there and do the work and get things done, by
Hmm.
voter drives. How do you see Little Manila being part of that narrative that with those three priority areas, housing, education, and the economy, how do you see Little Manila as playing a role?
Yeah, I think Little Manila Rising's role has been, since its inception through these grassroots led movements of these are issues that aren't being paid attention to. So whether it's historic preservation of the Little Manila neighborhood or ethnic studies in our schools, or even now COVID, 19 advocacy, I think a lot of it is who's what needs to happen and who's going to do it. And I think that's what's great about this organization is that there's a ton of people who have those visions and who have the drive to be there and do it. I think what needs to happen is, policy needs to match up and it needs to catch up actually
Yeah.
with what a lot of us are doing. And I think it's funny because, with my team, we're all young people, in our 20s really. And a lot of times, we're identifying needs of our community and we're identifying possible solutions that, our counterparts in the government are missing and they're not seeing until much later. And so how do we consult with our community members? I think a large problem with policy and with government is sometimes our leaders can be so distant from
Yeah.
the communities they're serving, and oftentimes they're not from them those communities themselves, they don't live in them, or they did but they moved on and they stopped seeing what's there. And when you're there, talking, we talk with neighbors all the time, and we're hearing, although we're working specifically on the COVID-19, virus and the vaccine, we're learning about what are these community members also struggling with, whether it's young people struggling with their Zoom classes or, fathers not being able to come home because they're working so much, like there's so many different issues going on. and part of it is just listening, and being in community with these people.
Yeah,
So
you're getting good intel when you go door to door helping people in COVID, because you see COVID is this layer
mhm,
over people's lives, and people
right.
haven't been able to do their lives. Now they are slowly, but or their lives have been gone and they have to remake their lives. I mean, I guess one of those issues has got to be, is there a place to make a living wage anywhere in Stockton?
Mhm, mhm,
And how do
yeah.
I take care if you're a single mom? How do you get childcare?
Mhm,
I mean,
yeah.
these are issues to think about. And so
Mhm.
you what are the real prospects of getting, say, some of these ideas, which are new and fresh and real of a generation, to those distant politicians who don't really know the neighborhoods and the people there.
Yeah, I think it's a big challenge because sometimes not only is there like a disconnect with, the people they're serving, but also their active constituents who, go to them and let these politicians know, like, this is how you're not serving us, or this is how you're messing up, and this is like what we need from you. And a lot of times the position and the role, in policy and government can be very self-serving, as we know, and as we see a lot of the times. And so yeah, I mean, it's hard to tell people, like, just go call your senator, or go to the office hours of your local politician, or to go vote, because a lot of times that doesn't really fix the issue, right? When the person in office is ignoring you. And I think what we see more and more is like people like us from our communities, wanting to run and to be the person that is in the room and making those decisions. And hopefully it's somebody that doesn't leave their community behind, and doesn't leave their values behind, right? Once they're in that position, because we hear and we see that it can change a person. And unfortunately that system isn't doesn't really have a lot of give, and doesn't really accept a lot of new ideas and a lot of new people, and even new philosophies on how these things should work, right? And so
Yeah.
like where is that issue coming from, and how are we amending that, you
Well,
know?
given that uh, recent history, Michael Tubbs ran again for mayor, lost. I'm sure it must have come as a kind of blow to the young people who supported him. How
Mm-hmm.
are young people like yourselves bouncing back? Well, number one, are they bouncing back? Are they getting up and saying, "Okay, you got us good then, that time, but we're getting back up," or what are people saying? And number two, what does it say about your feelings about? I guess you hinted at it a second ago. What does it say about your feelings about the political environment and its willingness to change?
Yes, I think, you know the the last election was a really big challenge. And I think it goes back to what you brought up earlier in the conversation about this area being a news desert. And definitely what contributed to um, Michael's loss was a lot of the media that was pushing back against him, um, with a lot of accusations and just misinformation, and the intentional disinformation about him and about people like him. Right? It didn't just affect Michael; he was the biggest person that it affected, but it affected others in the community doing similar work. It affects, our organizations for sure, even non-political ones, and it affects, just everyday people who are doing grassroots work. And a lot of us don't have positions of power, right? Um, we don't have a lot of the backing or the political support and the money support that can maybe shield a person away attacks online, or even these like political schemes, right, to push you out of this work. But it's happening a lot. It is happening in Stockton. It's happening in a lot of places where a lot of people are getting attacked and pushed out, basically, and it takes a big detriment on the well-being of these people. I know that it must have put a lot of strain on Michael and his family, to go through that, and looking at him not just as like this political figure, but as a real person who came from Stockton and carried a lot of these, hardships from his life, and is now in this position, but is facing a lot of the same racism and other things that he supposedly overcame by becoming a Stanford graduate and being a mayor, right? And so for a lot of us, like being in those positions doesn't negate all the other things you carry. And if you're like a young woman of color in a political office and you're getting attacked by older men, or just, you know, people who have a lot more money and power than you, what else can you do but like leave your post, because that's going to be the safest thing for you. And so that's the really alarming thing about what has happened recently in Stockton. And I think it is a very disheartening image for young people to see, because who wants to follow in that footsteps, you know? And I think Michael created a large movement, and something that I examined in my thesis of, he inspired so many to do what he did, and maybe not exactly, but to be a person that is so like outwardly and passionately like about Stockton, and wants to see Stockton thrive and grow. And so I think a lot of people are doing that, and maybe politics and government isn't the only way. And we have the Dylans and the Dons of the world who did it another way.
Yeah.
And I think young people are finding their footing, and wherever that may be. And I think that's what movements call for. I think we can't rely on one person. Definitely the civil rights movement was not just Martin Luther King Jr. It was, everyone who had a place in that. And I think today, when we think about where we're going, it's going to take a lot more than, one of us winning an election. It needs to be, a just a joined effort from everybody, and where are we and where's our energy being put into this?
But you do definitely see where you are now and what you're called to do. You definitely see yourself at Little Manila Rising as part of a movement.
Yeah, for sure. I think just being a young person doing anything here in Stockton, like I would say people I would say all the artists here in Stockton who are, you know, passionate about their art and are doing it in spite of everything they've been told, they're part of it too. I think the young people taking ethnic studies, right now in Stockton high schools are part of it. It it is this this collaborative effort, and maybe this like shift and maybe a mindset about who we are and like what we could be. And I see that in many of us. So I think for sure what we're doing here is not the most important thing, but is one of the important things that is helping people, get there. So everyone who is coming in with a similar vision. It doesn't have to be exact, but if it's just like caring about this place and wanting people to live a good life and to have the things they need to do it, I see them as part of my circle, or part of my community, as like we're doing these things,
Yeah.
so I think for sure, I think the movement is still there. If just because we're not like marching down the street, or voting someone in office that is going to be shouting us out all the time, it's not that it left. You know, um, Michael Tubbs did a lot for our community, and he still does a lot for us. Now he's out there nationally, taking these ideas and making sure that they don't go away. We have so many others who are continuing that for us. And so I think I think we're not short
Yeah.
of people for sure. I think what needs to change is maybe like these spaces allowing us, to really, you know, to really show them like, we know what we're doing, and we have what it takes to make decisions, to be there and to say, this is what we think the direction of a community should take place, or the policies that are happening, or the decisions being made. um you know I think that needs to allow more of us to come in. Yeah.
Well, tell me what is, and this will be my last question. I appreciate you coming on and talking to me. But what do you see
Thank you.
now
Yeah.
as the most urgent thing that you can possibly do at Little Manila?
Yeah, I think, as simply to put it, like we just can't stop. Like for example, like the COVID work, just because we reopened on June 15th, like it doesn't make, this reality any different. I think we can't get comfortable in what we have. I think a lesson, from Michael Tubbs's administration, his being in mayor, um, we can't be comfortable because someone like him is there for us. None of the work stopped, when he was elected. So I think what we need to do is just, continue on with our visions, and to not waver in that, and to also not be discouraged when we see uh like one loss,
Yeah,
maybe.
yeah.
To
Well, when
not
you,
be discouraged in it.
Celine, you mentioned a
Hmm.
vision. What is that overarching vision for people who
Yeah.
uh, may have just joined us, or they're listening? They say, "What is that vision? What
Hmm.
is Celine's vision from Little Manila Rising about Stockton?"
Yeah. Well, I think my vision for sure is um to see a place, finally have I don't know, I guess to finally just like have its place, if that makes sense, like to reclaim what it is, to be what it is, right? And so I think to reject all these ideas we formerly, I hope, have about Stockton being a horrible, miserable place, whatever it was, um, into this place that deserves a chance and deserves, a future that, where its people are happy and are thriving, and um, I don't have to worry about basic needs. And so, to me, it is such a simple vision, is just to wish for the best for our people and for our community. And I can't get any simpler than that. But it is investing in this place, reinvesting in it, and making sure we can create the best possible outcome for our people. So through education, housing, and jobs, um, all of those different things at play, right? Um, I think they all need to be a part of the conversation. I think it's not just one thing that we need to fix. I think it's, these issues are complex, they're intersectional. There's a lot of people involved in it, and we can't leave anyone out of it. So, my vision is, it's hopeful for Stockton. And I think that's, you know, the best way I can describe it.
That's good. We end with hope. Celine Lopez with Little Manila Rising. Thank you for being part of this podcast on Emil and Muck's Takeout.
Thank you, Emil. It was really nice talking to you.
Celine Lopez, a youth advocate for Little Manila Rising, whose latest project was going door to door to educate the Filipino, the Black, and Latinx community members in South Stockton about the coronavirus and the need for vaccination. Lopez is a recent Stanford graduate. She returned to her family home in Stockton, determined to lift up its hopes as a place with a future. And I'll be talking more to her and her cohorts in future episodes about their story, a story of building a new, diverse America in Stockton. And that's our program. I'm Emil Guillermo. Emil Amongst Takeout is a podcast available wherever you get your podcasts. The daily Emil Amongst Takeout is live at 2 p.m. Pacific, Monday through Friday, on Facebook Watch and on emilguillermo.media on Facebook. And you can catch the recording on amok.com. Check out the daily Emil Amongst Takeout for my takes on race, culture, and politics. It's the news from my Asian American Filipino perspective. Thank you for listening to this podcast edition. Till next time, I'm Emil Guillermo.